In a socially distanced world, Design United is an optimistic digital platform for collaborative design and connection. Welcome to Design United's 9th Design Conversation in Conversation with urbz. I'm Varna Shashidhar, founder principal of a regional landscape practice, BSLA, based in Bengaluru. I'm supported by ClayWorks Spaces. ClayWorks creates flexible workspaces that focuses on productivity and sustainability. I'm also supported by our enthusiastic Design United core and editorial teams in this endeavor. The aim behind Design United is to create an optimistic space for regional dialogue, connections, collaborations, and opportunities for young designers and design practices, a much needed network of support and peer mentorship during these uncertain times. The selected designers and design studios are working on innovative design and approaches and have a deep resonance with the place they are from. They genuinely believe in contributing to the environment and the community. We have had wonderful young designers and moderators from the region in our past conversations and presentations. We've had Bogar Studio and Studio Made, Anai Studio, Be Polite, Compartment S4, Three Flaneurs, architect Avinash Ankalge, all from India, Kavan Balasurya from Sri Lanka, and Studio Neba and Kolpa World from Nepal. We've had theorists and architects Vaishnavi Shukla, Ishita Shah join us. We've also had Studio Unbuilt from Mumbai and Eugene Koscaron from Singapore. We will be starting a new mentorship segment to Design Conversation this month on Saturday, 27th June, with architects Nisha Matthew Ghosh, curator of an exhibition upcoming in London next year, along with architect Minwi from Sarawak, Malaysia. Moderated by two young designers from Bangalore and Colombo. We also have a new segment in July, In Progress, featuring new practices with projects in progress, discussing their work. The first In Progress segment will be started by Para Studio, Harshit Nayak and Priyanka Rastogi, and Arjun Ravi from State of Mind. So please continue to join us every week on Saturdays, same time at 4:30 for the conversation. With this background to Design United and the upcoming series of lectures, let's move to the much anticipated presentation and conversation with urbz. I'm delighted to welcome our presenting designers for the evening, Rahul and Mathias from urbz. Their presentation will be followed by a moderated discussion. So please do type in audience questions for our designers, which will be answered in the discussion that will follow the presentation. Now, moving to urbz and introducing the co-founders, Rahul Srivastava and Mathias. urbz was co-founded by Rahul and Mathias. Rahul Srivastava is a social and urban anthropologist from St. Xavier's College in Mumbai, JNU in Delhi, and Cambridge University. And Mathias has studied government and economics at the London School of Economics, along with degrees in urban planning and urban information systems from Columbia University and University of Tokyo. urbz is an experimental action and research collective specializing in participatory planning and design. urbz works with citizens, organizations, and municipalities in Mumbai, Bogota, São Paulo, Geneva, and Seoul. Their work has been exhibited at prestigious venues such as MoMA in New York, MAXXI in Rome, and Bhau Daji City Museum in Mumbai. Welcome, Rahul and Mathias.
Hello.
Thank you very much.
Should we start the video? Hello.
Do we wait for the video and the screen sharing, Mathias?
I'm not sure.
Yeah.
Start sharing our screen now.
Okay, sure. I'll share the screen. Okay, sure. So, yeah. Can you all see my screen?
Yeah, we can.
Yes.
Okay, great. Okay, thank you so much for having us. It's a pleasure to be here with you and be able to talk about our work. Thank you for the invitation and also to the audience to follow this discussion today. We hope that we're going to have interactions with the audience, also questions coming from you guys. So yeah, it's a pleasure. So I'm Matias Echanove and Rahul. Let's a few words.
Yeah, and I'm Rahul Srivastava, and I'm happy to be here too. Yeah, let's start, Mathias. You can.
Okay, so we'll just take you through urbz, what we do, our practice, in a few slides. We won't make it too long because we want to leave some time for the conversation. And we can always go back to some of those projects on concepts that we're presenting now. So first of all, urbz was born in Daji, in Mumbai. This is where we started over 10 years back. And it was started by Rahul and myself. And the practice of urbz is really the coming together of anthropology and urban planning. So we're looking at the neighborhood, at the neighborhood as a scale of intervention, of recognition, and we're looking particularly at how people create neighborhoods. So what is the process behind the production of neighborhoods? Not just Daji. Of course, Daji has been a huge source of inspiration, but any kind of neighborhood, our first question is always, how do people contribute to creating the environment in which they live?
Just to add to what Mathias said, since it's all about the locality itself, it's about the neighborhood, it's about the people who live in those neighborhoods, their stories and the way they create arrangements to produce their life is what is our starting point. So the whole, right from the start, the idea of design as something which is emergent, something which is part and parcel of everyday life, has been a very important starting point for us.
So in Daji, we kind of gained confidence in the ability of people to create their own habitats. It sounds paradoxical because Daji is usually depicted as this gigantic slum. But what we found really interesting is the level of social organization, how communities come together to create schools, how the local economy produces houses, produces a distribution of goods, and produces so many other things that Daji is famous for. So this for us is really interesting. And this capacity has been shown in spite of context, which makes it very difficult for people to actually do basic things, such as investing in their houses or running a local business. So for many years, Daji has been able to manage in spite of a very adversarial context in terms of the government understanding of what they should do with Daji.
And Daji has also been an expression in many ways of the larger socio-economic and cultural history of the country as a whole. So community plays a very big role in the way in which the neighborhood is organized. We have always seen Daji as part of a much larger urban universe in which every city in the country has some expression of the kind of life we see in Daji, because it emerges from the same fabric. So it is not an exceptional place. It is actually part of a much larger reality. And yet it is special because the way those arrangements have taken place in Mumbai is very special. So that is why, in spite of 12 years of actively working in Dharavi, we still feel there are many things to be unpacked, and that is why we continue to operate from there.
So our motto that we devised when we started urbz was and still is the user-generated city. For us, the user is the starting point. So although we work a lot with design and we have many architects in the team, urbz was not started by architects, and it's not only an architecture practice. We do architecture and we do many other things, but the starting point has always been an attention to processes, attention to social, economic, cultural processes that create the fabric of the city. And architecture for us is one of the most interesting expression of those processes, because there is a materialization of things which are usually very hard to see. So this is, I would say, something that still guides us to this day. Rahul, you want to add something?
Continue, Mathias. Continue.
Okay. Okay. So our practice in Mumbai is really based on working with local builders and communities. I mean, that's one of the things that we do. We've been very involved in helping designing houses. So we've recently had design at Seoul, a commercial building on Dharavi Main Road, some housing. So we're really interested in doing this. And, you know, for us, again, what is really important there is the process. So how can we engage with the local artisans, with the local community? How can we build on the knowledge which is already there in the neighborhood? So we really try to be very careful about not coming with a preconceived notion of what should happen, how things should look like, how things should be done. But on the contrary, to start with this anthropological gaze of looking at how things happen. And then once we feel that we have an understanding and relationship within the neighborhood, start looking at how can we add value to what is already happening.
Agency for us has always been a very important aspect of engaging with the neighborhood. And the whole process of constructing the neighborhood physically is the best expression of that agency. And as Mathias said, that for us, this is something which is very self-evident, that it is not something which needs external intervention. The most communities, most human beings, most societies have the basic knowledge of producing their own physical environment. This is something which one can say as an urban planner as well as an anthropologist. And that has really been our starting point.
And what we found out very quickly is that this requires, if we want to work and do architecture or design at the local level, this really requires revisiting the practice on the way it's usually done. Here you see some examples of work really on site. And we've understood that even though we can design and plan in our office, and that's always good because it helps us clarify a sense of direction, the design really happens in situ, in the discussion, in the moment of construction. And this is something which is really truly fascinating for us as a form of practice. So I just mentioned a few things which are kind of, let's say, concepts or conceptual entry points to our approach and practice. Things that guide us in our work in Mumbai, but also in other cities, in Bogota, in Geneva, Switzerland, and other projects we've done in other cities such as Seoul and beyond. So one fundamental idea for us is that less is more. You know, we kind of turn upon its head the kind of classic modernist you know, motto of less is more. And we're trying to say less is more. What does it mean? It means that there's always more than meets the eyes, and that we need to understand the morphology or the typology, the kind of the form of the neighborhood as something which is an expression of much more. It's an expression of processes, So what seems to be messy at first may actually be the result of pretty organized processes on the ground. And this is why we never use the word informal to describe a neighborhood such as Shivajinagar in Mumbai or Dharavi, because we feel that it kind of has a connotation of something being irrational or not really having a form. We think that no, actually it's not because we don't really understand that form yet that there's no form or that it's actually a mess. In fact, there's much more to it, and we're trying to, our job is to really look at what are the elements that shape those urban structures.
And if we, there is a very strong tradition of people avoiding this kind of decoding or having a patience, right through colonial experiences also, we have known how cultures which are not understood or norms which are not understood are often simply classified as either primitive or unimportant. So there's a very, very big legacy in modern practice of not recognizing the kind of underlying patterns, not recognizing the way in which forms are emergent, largely because we ignore the processes. We don't understand them. We don't even try to understand them. So we definitely work from that point of view of avoiding any kind of preconceived notion of what a so-called messy neighborhood is all about.
When you start looking at the process of constructing a house, you start understanding who is involved, what are the skills, what is the economy of this production, and then you start seeing that, oh, actually there's a very professional organization at work, and it seems to be disorganized. Actually, it's all the contrary. And in Mumbai, we probably have one of the most efficient delivery of affordable housing anywhere in the world. I'm talking about speed and relative quality. In the photo you see on the left, you see mass housing in the background and what we call a homegrown locally built neighborhood on the foreground. And the complexity of the homegrown neighborhood is much higher, but also its cost is much less to produce, and it comes with a vibrant economy, unlike the mass housing in the background. So this idea of recognition, this is something that we take to, we've taken all of our practice everywhere, and we just show images of projects in Geneva and in São Paulo, Brazil. For us, when we go to a new place, when we have a new project, it's always first, okay, what is going on there? What are people doing already? How are they doing it? And then we build on that, and this is really the raw material that we have to work with. This is the raw material for urban planning, according to us.
You can continue.
Okay, and yeah, homegrown neighborhood. That's another key concept for us. So we think that neighborhoods such as Dharavi have been for too long dismissed as being slum or informal. And we really try to look at what is the intrinsic quality of those neighborhoods. How can we describe them in a way that would tell something important about the neighborhood, about its dynamic. And for us, homegrown really expresses the fact that what is so amazing about many neighborhoods in Mumbai, in India, and all over the world is when they are produced from within. So the people building the neighborhood also live in the neighborhood. And this is really unlike what is usually happening. I mean, what is happening in the kind of industrial, type of creating mass housing and whether it's luxury or low income. We see that it's always coming from outside. And here we have like a production that comes from within. So nobody says it's perfect, but everybody, what we really want to acknowledge there and to make very clear is that there's something important there. If you redevelop the neighborhood and you put mass housing instead, you would lose something which is fundamental and important, is the fact that this neighborhood that you've just destroyed had the capacity of creating itself and improving itself over time.
And not recognizing this is a very, very typical aspect of of either a state which is not interested in engaging with what these neighborhoods are, even by other members of society who believe that these are slums, these are neighborhoods which don't have any potential, only because of either their appearance or because of the fact that that there is the lack of recognition has not allowed it to grow and fully express that potential. It is in many ways the most fundamental expression of the existence of resources which are in-house, inbuilt, and they also, from the point of view of anthropology, they are again self-evident, because human societies have always existed, have always produced an inner energy, and yet somehow our modern conceptions of the city and of urban planning have never allowed those internal energies to be expressed. So by using the term homegrown neighborhoods, we are also reclaiming a very important part of what human existence has always done. It has always trusted the ability of people themselves to produce at least the fundamentals of what everyday life is all about, what a neighborhood is all about. And behind the notion of complexity, behind the notion of scale, we hide behind these notions and we refuse to recognize the potential. And that for us is an oversimplification. And that is what we'll also discuss.
And just to mention the photo on the right, this is a workshop in Matancheri with Kambushri women who are organized, and they do recycling among many other things. So we're doing a project now with the municipality of Kochi and GIZ, which is the German Development Corporation. And it's a participatory process to come up with a brief for a design competition. And our starting point was, again, to go and really talk to people at the local level and start learning from their experiences, their needs. It sounds obvious, but unfortunately, it's not happening enough. So this is what we it's participatory urban planning. This is what we really kind of want to promote, and this is what our practice is about, and in many different contexts. One more concept: form follows process. Again, something that sounds obvious. Yes, I mean the form will be generated through a certain process. But if we really look at the process differently, if we look at the process which is not only only marginally driven by the architect or the urban planner, and mostly based upon existing processes, and also a participatory process, so something that we put in place which really kind of builds on community organization, local leaders, also people who don't get their voices heard usually. If you really try to kind of put this process together, then we'll get a different form, and the form that will emerge will not be this classic modernist form. It can be excellent architecture also, but it's going to be different, and that's something that we have to recognize.
And if you see that the third image at the bottom left about which shows India, the map of India on one hand, and the city of Mumbai on the other, this is the closest we could come to have a visual expression of what the nature of urbanism in India is all about. Something which is a very challenging process for us, because almost everybody within the world of urban practice takes for granted a certain definition of what urban is. And our a sort of adherence to this notion that form follows process made us question our taken for granted notion of what this urban form is. And when we began to explore these questions through a project of ours, which is about circulatory urbanism, we began to understand that urbanism in India is something which is not linked to just a static belonging to one city. In this map, you have people from different neighborhoods in Mumbai stringing their connections to the native places where they come from in different parts of the city. This was part of the Bhau Museum exhibit of ours. And in that, and people were doing it interactively on their own. It was only when the recent, the virus, because of the virus and the pandemic, when there was this mass migration which began to happen, so-called migration which began to happen from cities back to villages, that there was a semblance of understanding what circulatory urbanism is in some other form. But if we simply ignore it, then even things which we know, all of us as urbanists know that cities in India are are populated by a large number of service providers and people and workers who have dual belonging. They also belong to the villages where they come from, but it never factors into our understanding of what urbanism is or urban planning is. So because and this is a 6-year-old project, we did it for a long time. We were simply following the stories of people in Dharavi and other neighborhoods in Mumbai, and that is where this image came from. So this is just to explain why the notion of form following process is very important, because we otherwise again tend to oversimplify or we ignore the reality staring at us.
And maybe I'll let you continue, Rahul, on explain the Toolhouse.
On the Toolhouse. Okay. So again, in the context of the form follows process, one of the most important aspects for us to recognize about the neighborhood of Dharavi was that a lot of people happened to be working from the places where they lived. And at the same time, there were workspaces in which workers were, they would spend the night over there. It acted like a dormitory. So the same space began to have multiple options and multiple uses. And for us, this became the most important starting point for understanding the form of Dharavi itself. The so-called messiness, the so-called sort of untidiness was really a result of the multiple ways in which people were using space. And by calling it, giving it a name which actually is not new, it is part of a trajectory of urban forms which can be found in Singapore and Japan, all over Asia. In fact, sometimes called the shop house, sometimes called the home factory. But we said, well, Dharavi has its own, and it is called the Toolhouse. And for us, both recognizing the form became a very important starting point of trying to also collaborate with the people who construct in Dharavi. So when we began to actually frame the entire construction process by talking to both artisans and contractors who make homes, and by formally looking at each unit of what they produced as a tool house, we began to understand the intricacies both in economic terms but also in the physical form itself.
And I just want to mention that the Toolhouse is now also something that we deploy in our own projects. On the right is a house that we occupied for about 3 months for participatory planning process in Geneva. And so the house has become, in this project, a tool for creating the plan. These are some images also from Bogota, where we have also a team which was started about I don't know, 5-6 years ago, and there the work in Bogota, like in the work in Mumbai, is a lot about working with the local artisans and really kind of connecting with the processes at work and trying to bring architecture into existing processes. And so our projects over there are always, again, community driven. They also involve often students. Here on the forefront, you see Andres with the glasses and the tattoo. He's the head of the team over there. He started it. And he's very engaged in several neighborhoods in different parts of Bogota. And so, these are just some examples of buildings that we've helped design or we co-designed with local contractors and the community in Dharavi, in Kazuka, Bogota, a temple in Shivajinagar. We also have this here, a little example of an object, and we like to engage in different ways. So sometimes it takes the form of artwork or objects. And this is a double-decker tea carrier that we produced as part of a kind of co-creation process, talking with the vendor, but also this was made in the neighborhood itself, the object. So it was about innovating using the local skills and creativity. And we also write a lot. So we publish a lot of articles on urbz.net. We're right now doing a series on how Dharavi is responding to the lockdown. So, this is there, but we also just, generally publish about our projects and also about things that concerns us, that interest us. So there's lots of analytical writings also. Yeah, we're working on a new book, and that's another one, an older one of the year. Rahul?
Yeah, no, I think that's it. Yeah.
Okay.
Good.
And maybe just quickly, so we do quite a lot of exhibitions. So these are examples of exhibitions that at the Daji Museum in Bordeaux, in France. Producing videos. So you can see a lot of that on our website. This is the exhibition at MoMA. And so then when we do exhibitions, sometimes we work with local artisans to produce things such as the embroidery that you see over here, which actually was produced in order to kind of express the concept that Rahul talked about before, the circulatory urbanism. And it was done by a master embroiderer in Daji. And on the left is the exhibition we're part of at the MoMA in New York. And here again, some more examples. For us, the exhibition is a really nice way of trying to communicate our work to a very large public. We also love to do things that all kinds of people can relate to, including kids. So that's very important to us. Maybe just examples of participatory workshops that we organize in different places. So this is really part of our process. Is when we go into planning mode, when we have to kind of look at the larger picture and work on a plan. It always happens through events which bring people together, which allow the brainstorm to come from all kinds of sources, which are also festive events. For us, it's really important that those moments should be social, because at the end of the day, what we're trying to create is always a neighborhood or something, or a public square, or a place which is a public space, so and a place of interaction. So it needs to be produced and conceived also through interaction. In fact, the process again generates a certain form, and so the process itself needs to be one of multiple interactions and a social moment.
For us, in fact, the workshop has been the simplest and the most effective form of a lot of our methodology. And the key is, of course, to be site specific, to work in the neighborhood and locality, and that is where we organize our workshops in most cases. And the idea again is to sort of break through divides of the so-called expert, the specialist, and the local resident. In fact, the local resident often becomes the most important expert, because the neighborhood is often the subject of our inquiry. So it's a very simple, effective tool, and that is something which has remained with us for the last 12 years.
And then we produce all kinds of reports that you can see online. And maybe just a few things we love to, and examples of our work also. So we really try to kind of, we're always interested in connecting culture to urbanism. And in fact, now we're working on a project in Geneva where culture is a starting point to start to think about a neighborhood. So how can we, and it's a new neighborhood, so how can we generate a neighborhood with cultural actors, a neighborhood which will reflect the culture of the locality. So it's such a, I mean, and of course it's a very broad kind of notion, culture, but basically it's about communication, language, relationship, and it's about what to create together and how we create community. And for us, this is really where we go on look for the elements that are fundamental to creating a neighborhood. And this is something that Rahul already talked about now. So I think maybe Rahul, you want to add something about?
Yeah. This is just like we discussed it earlier, because the fact that one very important aspect of contemporary life, which often does not get adequate attention when we talk about places, is because where we tend to fix a place, and we ignore the huge amount of mobility which exists in our lives. And we have looked at mobility in the last, almost 7-8 years through our project on circulatory urbanism as a very important and fundamental aspect of urban experience in India. and something which is not so difficult for us to understand and accept right now, as we mentioned earlier, post the pandemic, because we suddenly realize that our cities are deeply and entrenched with our countryside. They are not two separate places. That there are, mentally, a lot of people live in two places. There is a way in which the dual household family structure is the norm. How does all this translate into an understanding of urbanism in the context of form, expression, and design remains a challenge for us, because we are so used to a very neat expression on what habitats are. And this has been something which has been challenged to us by our focus on the concept of mobility. Yeah.
And it's very difficult to express some realities sometimes. For example, typically, statistically, India is 70% rural, 30% urban. And, statistically, someone is either urban or rural. You can be in the village and the city at the same time. Yet, experientially, and in the way people organize their lives, especially at the scale of the family, they are often in two places at the same time. So a family would be both in the village and in the city. And so those relationships are very, very hard to express quantitatively, statistically. So sometimes art installations and other forms of expression of this reality is necessary. And this is what this kind of participatory art piece was trying to achieve. So maybe I'll just mention here that maybe Rahul, you can maybe talk a bit more about it, but yeah, go ahead.
So basically the idea of culture is, as Mathias explained earlier, is often seen to be as if it is part of an ornamentation of human experience. It is part of an expression, and it becomes endemic to identity and ethnicity. And as a student of anthropology, one has always looked at culture from that point of view. But the closer you go and deeper you go into the concept of both, of culture as well as urbanism, you realize that culture is so much about agency and activity. And the expression of human culture is often in the form of creating neighborhoods, creating environments in which people live. And for us, when we talk about collective creativity, this is something very deep. It's not just about the fact that people are coming to only bring in their creative skills. Creative skills are, of course, very important, but the whole process is a sign that yes, there is a very active and a very creative process going on at every fundamental level. So even though when we, it is in a workshop, it could be in a design competition, or it could be in the form of, any research inquiry which we do, we talk about the idea of coming together. We talk about collective creativity. The idea of collective creativity is very deeply entrenched into an understanding of placemaking, into an understanding of how human beings in different forms occupy that place, and how much cultural expression is about the expression of locality. And this is something which for us continues to be a very important part of our process.
And I just want to mention also that one of the projects that we're working on now, which is in India, which is one of biggest, most challenging and most interesting project now, is in Kochi, where we were invited by the municipality of Kochi and the GIZ, which is the German Development Corporation, to do a brief for an urban design competition, which is just open now. Like, you can start registering to getting more information about it on the website of the competition. So if you are an urban designer or a student and are interested, you should go check out the website there. It's been super interesting as a process, because the brief was produced again through a lot of field work, a lot of interaction with lots of stakeholders. Yeah, just go and check it out, and it's still an ongoing project of ours now. I think this we can skip. And basically, yeah, I mean, we've been very lucky to be able to work on full-scale neighborhood plans So this is one of them in Geneva. So it takes existing buildings and then adds new buildings. And as mentioned before, the form that emerges at the urban level is not one that could have emerged out of just sitting in a studio and drawing on a white piece of paper. Every single detail has been discussed with local residents, but also involving students and other guests. So in this specific project, which we call Delta V, so yeah, I mean, it's something that we feel is the future of urban planning, and this is really kind of taking participation to the next level. Yeah, so I think we leave it here, and so we love this work and process, and we hope that you can come to some of our workshops, visit our office in Mumbai, and of course come to the website. And now I think we finish now. Rahul, unless you want to add something.
No. Thank you so much. It has been enjoyable presentation, and we look forward to question and answers. No.
Thank you.
Thank you. Looking at different approaches is key to Design United's design conversations. Rahul and Mathias, thank you so much for sharing your approach and wonderful work with urbz that moves beyond architecture into social process, enriching design through social process and participatory planning. Thank you very much. With this, we open our session for conversation. We invite the audience to please share your questions for our presenters. Please type in your questions for Rahul and Mathias and urbz. Please also leave feedback. I would like to introduce and welcome our moderators for the conversation. Architect Srishti Shah, joining us from Ahmedabad. Srishti is a senior architect at Surya Kakini Associates. She's also been associated with the CEPT University as a teaching assistant with their summer and winter schools and construction studio. Our second moderator is Alicia Lad, joining us from Mumbai. She is a fourth-year architecture student from Academy of Architecture. She's passionate about theory of architecture and design. She's also a member of our Design United editorial team. Welcome, Srishti and Alicia. With this, we open our design conversation. Thank you.
One second, there seems to be a problem with the camera. Okay, I'll just start regardless. That was a very engaging and informative presentation given by you, Rahul and Mathias. Thank you so much for joining us today. And a big thank you to all our viewers as well for making it to the session today. A brief introduction of myself. Like Varna said, I am an architecture student. I am Alicia. And yeah, the camera is on now. Yeah, so I'm an architecture student, and I am, and I hold an avid interest in urban design and the theory of architecture. I'll be co-moderating the session today with Srishti.
Look forward.
Thank you for the great presentation, Rahul and Mathias. I'm Srishti, and I'm an architect based out of Ahmedabad. Just to get started, we have just structured our discussions and thoughts from everything we gathered from your presentation and the questions we got from the audience into broadly, three abstract categories, which is design processes, relevance and way forward post the pandemic, and opinions. So Alicia, yes, let's start.
Yes. So Mathias and Rahul, Very interestingly, you mentioned neighborhoods as agencies and drivers for your design, as well as homegrown neighborhoods. It seems that your design process is always very heavily influenced by the narratives of the people who live there eventually, and the conception and perception of the design follows that. We would be curious to know what kind of limitations and challenges you might face in this kind of design process.
Yeah, that's a very nice question. The thing is that it is not that these are not just drivers. These are very important aspects of the reality around us. And, it is also as much about our own methodology, our own desire to sometimes create distance, creating distance between certain context and ourselves, and looking at design sometimes as a tool of either enhancing that distance or working with other forms of distances. So we feel that first of all, we should not be looking at the neighborhood as if it is some external driving force. It's not. It is the context in which design emerges, and we ourselves, we are as people who are supposedly outside the neighborhood, whether there's a homegrown neighborhood or some other neighborhood, we often tend to think of ourselves as somehow above. We have a gaze, which is sterile, which is external. And we often think of the tools of design as a way of bringing in order. So this is not at all what our approach is, and hopefully our presentation clarified that. The challenges which are there are obviously, challenges which are to do with the general conceptual and theoretical limitations of our practice, where we tend to subscribe to this notion that those neighborhoods need help, there are victim spaces, etc. Those are really the biggest challenges. The challenges that which come in the way of us recognizing. It's, for example, if an architect or an urban planner is saying, "Oh yes, but I've spent 6 years studying architecture, and why do I have to listen to someone who does not know anything about building and construction? And why are you paying so much of attention to that process?" And for us, that is a very problematic starting point. So those are the challenges.
Matthias, do you have anything to add?
I think because there's little time. Of course, I would love to add stuff to this, but maybe let's take another question on let more people ask questions.
Yes.
Otherwise,
yes. Okay. So connecting back to what you said about architects maybe having a gaze with which they look at these problems and creating sterile environments, what would your take be on combating the almost capitalist process-driven spaces that are being created in cities today, which lead to monotony and this form of almost lack of empathy?
yeah, we have a word for the kind of urbanism which is happening in India, in all over the world actually today at a very very accelerating pace, and we call it the spreadsheet urbanism. And it looks like cities are basically literal translation of financial plans, of regulations. So it's almost straight, like the architect is actually not present in this process, and nor is the inhabitants. Basically cities today are being planned by accountants and lawyers. And unfortunately, we get a result which is extremely poor in terms of the ability of the new projects, the ability they have of reflecting a local culture or local economy or aspirations of the residents. So this is something that for us is also a product of speculation, and more than see, like, first we really want to make a distinction between a kind of speculative development, which is really driven by a certain extreme form of capitalism, and the local market that we see at work in every neighborhood. So when you set up your shop, when you provide a service, when you build a house for someone, that's also the market, But for us, this is not the enemy, This local economy actually keeps the neighborhood alive. It's something that we feel is very important. It's full of potential, and this is how people kind of get by. So we don't want to direct the critique at this economy, even though, you know, some aspects of it are also capitalistic. But for us, it's more like the bigger picture, you know, of what is happening at the scale of cities.
Coming back to the concept that you said of circulatory urbanism and migratory patterns seen around the city, would that put into question the concept of right to the city? And do you think people shape the formation of cities, or is it that the built fabric shapes people's lives more?
Mathias, you want to take this or?
I can start on this and then let you continue maybe. So yeah, I mean, definitely for us, one thing which is extremely important now is to really think about how do you give the right to access the city. So it's not just the right of you know, living there forever. It's the right to just access it. And you know, so many of us have moved to cities for a few years in our life. We don't stay forever, but we need to be able to access the city for education, for economic opportunities, for health, you know, for many other things. So those cities need to be accessible to the majority. So we need to also revise the idea of housing for life, you know, and maybe we need to start thinking about accommodation. How do we accommodate a population which is a need to access without necessarily staying forever? And just this conceptual shift in how we look at what we need to produce in cities is very important, and would allow, you know, like give people the right to actually, or the possibility to access the city. Yeah, I'll let you.
No, exactly. And you know, like over-interpreting the right to the city into a right of possessing you know, a private form of ownership is totally different from what the notion of rights generally you know, expresses. So for us, the right to access the city, you know, is completely different from the right to ownership, which is something which how we have often reduced the notion of right to the city. And that is why, you know, we have the way in which we talk about you know, everybody should necessarily own property, and in fact the right to the city has also been reduced to a notion of simply privatizing urban space. So that is something which we must be very careful about. At the same time, right to access the city is vital, you know, and because cities are concentrated spaces of economic and political power. At the same time, this does not in any way challenge a person's right to be mobile, to also have an access to a secure home in the village, because this is the reality. You know, in countries like India, in countries in Africa, other Asian countries, you find that attachment to the village is something which is not of the same kind as, say, in Latin America or in the Northern American states, because there it was really linked to a history of slavery, a history of plantation economy, where people left the villages, the rural. And the narrative of right to the city, which is a very valuable one, which was shaped by that history, you know, was really about the right to political identity, you know, to citizenship and to equal citizenship. Now, in India, that the same narrative is equally valuable at a fundamental level, you know, because the right to access the city is very much about all of that. It's also about citizenship. But in many parts of the world, that does not mean a relinquishing of your attachment to the village, you know, and this is in many parts of the world, particularly on the African and the Asian subcontinent, historically one has seen. So we need to understand that right, not as by not reducing it to one or the other thing. We cannot overinterpret that right, you know, which is otherwise co-opted by people who simply talk about ownership as the only form of expression of that right. And that is why we talk about accommodation. That is why we talk about having dual household structures, both in the village and the city, as part of that process.
And I just want to add very clearly that along with the right to the city, we really feel that there's a strong need for a right to be mobile. And this has really been one of the things that has been an advantage for many people in India, is that actually you can be mobile because the railway is still very affordable, and that allows nearly 9 billion annual trips through trains all over the country. Which is amazing. It's much more than China, for example. And this is really a strength. Really understanding those connections between the city and the village is key to thinking about a sustainable future for India also, and preserving the landscape in between those two typologies.
Yes, so while we also spoke about context, and interestingly, in your presentations, there's work across various countries. It's not just India. So I'd like to ask, what are the similarities or probably challenges or differences or even learnings in that process of working across different contexts? If there's any stories you could share, because like Toolhouse, you said you've appropriated it for India as well as Geneva. So what are the kind of challenges and learnings in the process?
See, all these concepts that we mentioned during the presentation, so the homegrown neighborhood, form follows process, the idea of recognition, or the concept of the Toolhouse, these are all concepts that we've developed in India and that we are applying in other places. So recognition is the first thing we do when we go to any place. Homegrown is the capacity of the neighborhood to develop itself. We always look for it. How is the neighborhood developing itself? What are people doing for for themselves? Form follows process. How do we allow a process which is giving a new form, and how do we accept a form which is not the kind of standard modernist plan that we always used to see? Because it has been generated through a different process. And the Toolhouse again, we know Toolhouse is so many things to say about it also in terms of how universal it is. People have been working a lot from home these days. It's not always a blessing. We're not saying it's good or bad. We're just recognizing this typology as being fundamental, very important, especially helping the local economy develop when there's not much else, and especially in high density cases where you have to do the most out of the space you have.
Okay. So India has been your canvas of inspiration.
Yes. Yeah, we always love to to say that this is really an example of knowledge transfer from India to the world. India is a space of tremendous creativity, innovation, and again, it's about recognition, because this is happening right before our eyes, and sometimes at the policy level, it's not being recognized. Make in India. It's happening. It doesn't have to be Apple coming and setting up a factory. It's happening in neighborhoods. It's happening all over. If we don't recognize this, we're going to lose it. And this is something that we've always felt very, very strongly about. The capacity is there. And it's already existing. It's already alive, but it should be recognized and supported.
Right. Thank you. Now that we are all in this pandemic world, of course, some questions related to that would definitely be a part of this. So one that is definitely on everybody's mind is the fact that you've worked very closely with Dharavi all these years, and now with these new norms of social distancing and this informal settlements becoming some sort of incubators also at some point of diseases, are there any new ways of approach that you are going to take forward from here, or is there any kind of interventions that you have in mind that you will want to go ahead post this new normal world?
You don't want to start, or?
No, you start. I'll follow you.
Okay. No, one thing which is really important is that we should not. So first thing that we've learned is that density and mobility have to come hand in hand. If you do density but you don't allow mobility, then it's a disaster. And that's why the lockdown was a disaster. All around the country, it was terrible. It was terrible to. At the moment in which there was so little cases to prevent people from doing what they always plan on doing if things were getting difficult in the cities, to go back to the village, and this is not just migrant workers, they've always been migrant workers on the road, migrants. No, these are families who've been living in the city for generations sometimes, and they still go back to the village, and this is still a backup plan. So density without mobility is unbearable, and this is what has been created in the lockdown, and this is why cases have just multiplied. And in fact, definitely, it was bad planning, and it was based on bad understanding of how connected people were to the villages. So that's one thing. We will not we'll never be drawn to saying that no, but we need to de-densify, because this is classic kind of things which have been said many times over and over again. We understand density sometimes is too much, sometimes it's very difficult to live with, But still, it does provide access. And this is not for us or urban planners or policymakers to say that no, now you have to spread out, you have to leave this place. It can't be done like that. In fact, it's not just Dharavi. I mean, every village, every neighborhood, every small town is just as dense. It's density is all over, and it's a way. Why is it dense? It's because social connections are dense. It's because density creates economic opportunities. So you can't just like throw this, like throw the baby with the bathwater. You have to understand that this is a fundamental dimension of urban life, and there's a very sustainable aspect to density also. So and also, I mean, it was like in the new research that has come out on density on COVID. It's not the places with the highest density which have been the most affected. It's the poorest places, or the places with the least access to health care. So those are just I think equations are a bit too simplistic. Yeah.
Again, relating to the pandemic itself, you had a project in the works, I think, Homegrown Street right now, and because of social distancing norms that have been put in place, I think it came to a halt. So how has working remotely been for you? Because urbz as a firm relies on interaction and engagement so heavily. So it must have come with its challenges.
Yeah, in the sense it has been, of course, because for us being embedded in the neighborhood context, and especially in Dharavi, because our office has been there for so many years now. So there have been a number of challenges, and our office right now is actually locked down, obviously, because we cannot access it. But what we have is an amazing network of people and contacts, and through our team members from wherever they are, all over the city and the Mumbai metropolitan region, they are constantly in touch through phones. So we have been, for the last 5 weeks, and even before that, constantly updating what the situation is in Dharavi. So we have been actively in touch using phones and other modes of communication. So yes, so it has been a challenge because we would prefer being there, but obviously we understand the peculiarities of the situation right now, and we have to respect whatever the civic norms are right now. At the same time, communication is constant and the stream of information is constant, and you can have a look at whatever we have been writing and presenting briefly through the interviews we do. Every week, our team meets between 25 to 30 people online through phone calls and are in touch.
Okay, thank you. Srishti, the next question.
Yeah, so just want to move on to very broad topics now. That is, if we go through architecture education that's been lately taught, and some sort of romanticizing nature of squatter settlements, you think that's what is happening? And backdrop of Dharavi, several varying stereotype of slums in general also is it's sort of in trend these days. How have you? Of course, your practice had started way before that, but how have you actually broken from that notion and actually taken and started your practice there? And what are the sort of baby steps that you took in the beginning to sort of get your hold in that place?
Yes, you want to?
Yeah, I'll start. Yeah, I mean, we've just been fascinated by Dharavi, but not just by Dharavi. I mean, we've been working in Shivajinagar, in Bendup, and many other parts of Mumbai, and many other parts of India. For us, it's really about recognizing the challenges and the complexity of it, and recognizing how sometimes you have to look at how, if you want to build, improve, and look at what can improve the existing conditions, you have to look at what people are doing. So there is a tremendous amount of positive energy there, that we need to express, or we need to talk about. And this is not being romantic. It's really, being very pragmatic also about, how can we move ahead? For us, the biggest danger is to be utopian and say that no, but we can create the new city out of scratch, and we destroy the city and create this neighborhood and create a new one, and this is going to be a middle class neighborhood. This is pure utopia for us, and we reject this very strongly. Say that no, the pragmatic approach is to start from the complexity of what is there, and this is really where I would say when it comes to architectural education. We feel there's still something missing, even though we've seen also a tremendous change in architectural education in the past 10 years, in which there's amazing teachers out there also, and students who are really eager to kind of do things differently and really think on their feet and understand the city from the point of view of the users. That we see all the time, and this is really amazing. But still, I would say the main issue with architectural practice today, and it's a big challenge, is how do you not start from scratch? How do you start from the existing condition? Because it's much more complicated. But for us, it's not less creative. It's not because you have to take an existing given condition as a starting point that it's not going to be a very creative exercise. On the contrary, it's going to be all these new things that emerge, all these discussions you can have, all these new learnings that you do is what triggers your creativity. So the white page, the tabula rasa, for us is not a prerequisite for a creative practice in architecture.
Yeah. In fact, just to add to that, well, we talked earlier about how India is very much a starting point of inquiry, and how much we have exported ideas from here, practice from here. There's also a very important thing we have learned, through our shared conversations with the European context and the Indian context, and which is something which initially was new to me as well. It is only in conversations with Mathias that when I began to understand this whole idea of recognizing what exists, but also how it is rooted in a particular space. Europe has a very strong tradition of recognizing terroir, the land, the soil, which produces everything. Whether it is in the context of design, whether it's in the context of habitats, whether it's a context of food, and this kind of paying attention in a detailed way to a locality is something which I personally found in not as strong, even in conversations I was having with architects, urban planners, etc., my friends over here, because I always found there was an impatience of looking at what exists. It is, and in fact, when Mathias and me began to collaborate 12 years ago, you talked about the early steps. One of the early steps was really for me to understand the gaze which he and his experience and our networks between Europe and India were also doing. Having the patience to understand what a locality is, what is its language, how is it rooted. Dharavi became important for us because, of course, it was very much a symbol of a certain kind of a history of, say, ethnic marginalization on one hand, but at the same time, tremendous energy, tremendous presence of artisanal skills. And then we also realized that, yes, these artisanal skills are also connected to the social history. Most of our artisans, the kumbhars of Kumbharwada and Dharavi, the leather makers of Dharavi, these are all part of socioeconomic histories which are linked to caste and community in India for centuries. So there is no, how it comes together and forms a neighborhood, and how that neighborhood is the starting point for analysis is something which, which we need to understand as people interested in design from whatever field we come from. So the eye of, a patient eye of understanding what a locality is, the neighborhood. Otherwise, we normally come across a lot of impatience. And this idea of, starting from a tabula rasa is an example of impatience. Who the hell wants to deal with all the messiness which exists? A neat slate is a wonderful place. The stroke of your first paint brush stroke is exciting, but that is also naive sometimes. That's in fact more naive and romantic than taking into consideration the complexity of what exists in a rooted way.
I think that's really well put. Thank you.
I think so. We have really run out of time. We had a lot of more questions, but to bring this to a quick end and to sign off on this note, we would like for you to tell us a personal story of one of the narratives with the people that you have worked with that maybe touched your heart and left an impression on you.
I mean, maybe I just I can say something about one of the first contractor that we really started documenting So we've been documenting a lot of local builders, local contractors. That was, we discovered, Bendup, and particularly the part which is built against a little hill. So this is in the east, the northeast of Mumbai suburbs, and this is this contractor called Amar, who was building really fantastic houses in Bendup. We first documented, the full process of creating a house, and then we started also talking to, the people for whom he had built houses. And what was so nice to see is, how much pride, how much agency, how much also people were coming to him, because, he would really kind of push the envelope in terms of design, and he could do this in Bendup because he over there, it's a community which is also a Maharashtrian community, which is, much more, was much more established. And so there you could kind of, do things which are slightly, louder in terms of architecture. And you cannot do this in Dharavi because if you do a house which looks new, then you get lots of harassment. But when we saw this potential and when we saw the craft of Amar, we just, that we developed a relationship with him and we kept on going back. We've done little projects with him, and that really kind of sparked our desire to kind of go and explore what other contractors are doing all over the city and really kind of start looking at the local builder as an artisan. So that was something that we kind of, learned from that interaction and from Amar in particular.
And in fact, same Amar's neighborhood, is we had a very interesting conversation with, again, another very experienced resident who was saying that, the slope on which the neighborhoods grew up in Bhandup reminded him of the slopes back in Ratnagiri, from where he came from. And he said that I has to keep warning everybody that, listen, we have experience of working with flooded zones. And then he showed how his house was so resilient, and that those people who, of course, refused to acknowledge him later on found their houses washed away. But those who respected his, and then he became, of course, a very important figure in the same neighborhood. So yes, I think those two anecdotes.
And actually, just in the same neighborhood, we also saw this temple, which was interesting. We started talking to a lady who was taking care of the temple, she said that, actually, this temple is the sister temple of another one which was in the Konkan. And we always have this thing, this project of going, because we were looking at the relationship between village and the city. And then once we went, to see this other temple, it was close to Khed, no?
Khed, very close to
Khed. And we had to drive like a really, really long time, like out in the, through the forest, and we got to the temple, which is quite amazing, the village and everything. But then there was like another story which was stretching all the way to a cave, which is one of the most beautiful places I've ever seen, where the original guru of the temple had been spending 10 years, and it was fantastic, and it was just like a local religious community which was sharing its time between the Konkan and Mumbai, and so like all these stories, once you start like talking to people on pulling, like just following the thread of where do people come from, what is the life trajectories, you start understanding things which are when you multiply this story 1,000 times, 100,000 times, a million times, then it gives you like a very interesting pattern of urban development.
And it's a very dangerous thing to ask us to start narrating anecdotes because we have thousands of them. So one triggers the memory of the other. So I think maybe we should stop, otherwise.
Yes, well, thank you for that very lovely, very personal insight to your stories. And Srishti, you can conclude.
Yes, thank you so much. I think the sheer diversity of work and the mediums of expression are extremely interesting to us because, as Varna mentioned in the beginning, the participatory process is something that one is not really aware of its nitty-gritties, which I am sure we got to know a lot of it from today's conversation. So thank you so much, both.
Thank you.
Thank you. Thank you for the invitation and great questions.
Yes.
Thank you so much, urbz. Sorry, Priyanka. Thank you, urbz, for a wonderful presentation. Thanks, moderators, speakers, and audience for a great conversation today. Have a good evening and see you next week. Priyanka from Design United will share our upcoming series of events.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you, Rahul.
Bye-bye.
Thank you, Mathias. And thank you to our moderators, Srishti and Alicia, for an interesting conversation. Design United as a platform is expanding, and we are now planning on featuring 2 films on landscape. We have a film on transformation through landscape coming soon, and have recently released a film about crafting landscapes on YouTube. So we hope you will like, share, and subscribe to our YouTube channel. So far, Design United has successfully completed 10 installments of Design Conversation, and we have many more exciting speakers lined up with designers across the spectrum joining us to share their thoughts. Next week, we have Nashra Balgambala from Pakistan and Studio Blanco and Kalpataru Bali from Bali. So make sure you join us next Saturday at the same time for an extremely exciting conversation. Design United as a platform is a collaborative space, and we encourage everybody to collaborate with us, volunteer with us, and help us build the Design United community. We hope that excited and interested volunteers will contact us. We are always open to DMs on Instagram, as well as our email inbox is always open for your emails. Thank you. Thank you, everybody.